March 17, 1945. Somewhere along the frozen Ruhr Valley. The earth was ash and bone. Snow fell through skeletal trees, settling on brick dust and shattered glass. In the cellar of what had once been a schoolhouse, Greta Hoffmann pressed her palm against her daughter's forehead and felt the fever burning beneath the skin like a smothered coal. The child was 6 years old. Her name was Lise. She had not opened her eyes in 2 days. Above them, the war growled and thundered. American artillery pounded the eastern approaches to the city. The sound rolled across the valley in waves, each concussion shaking loose more plaster from the cellar ceiling. Greta had stopped flinching at the noise weeks ago. What terrified her now was the silence between the shells, the terrible quiet in which she could hear her daughter's shallow breathing, the rattle in her small chest that sounded like pebbles tumbling in a tin cup. There were 11 women and children in that cellar. They had been there for 9 days. The youngest was 3 months old, the oldest was 72. They had no medicine. They had no bandages. They had a single candle, half a loaf of black bread gone green with mold, and a bucket of snow melted over a makeshift stove fashioned from broken bricks and splinters of furniture. When little Lise had first fallen ill, Greta had torn strips from her own slip to wipe the child's face. Now those strips were stiff with dried sweat and grime, useless as bark. Frau Weber, the old woman, sat in the corner whispering prayers to a God she was no longer certain was listening. She clutched a photograph of her son, killed at Stalingrad 3 years prior. She had been a nurse once, in the First War, but that knowledge was worth nothing now. Knowledge without tools is only memory. Memory without hope is only haunting. Outside, the American guns fell silent. For 6 years, the women of the Third Reich had been told they were building a new world. They had been told their sacrifice was noble, that their sons and husbands were heroes, that the hardships they endured were the birth pangs of a 1,000-year empire. They had believed, or at least most of them had tried to believe, because belief was easier than despair and despair was everywhere. By the winter of 1945, that belief had curdled into something else. The cities were ruins. The men were gone, dead or captured or still bleeding in some frozen trench far to the east. The Führer's voice still crackled over the radio, promising miracle weapons and final victory, but the women had stopped listening. They knew the truth. They could see it in the eyes of the soldiers stumbling westward in retreat, boys of 15 and old men of 60 pressed into uniform with rifles they barely knew how to load. They could smell it in the smoke that hung over every town, the acrid stink of burning files and burning futures. The women had learned to survive. They foraged in bombed-out buildings for anything edible, potato peelings, nettles, the bones of dead horses. They bartered wedding rings for flour. They slept in basements and subway tunnels and the rubble of their own homes. They became experts in small miracles: how to make soup from nothing, how to keep a child warm with only newspaper and body heat, how to distinguish the sound of an American bomber from a British one by the pitch of its engines. But there were some things they could not do. They could not cure infection. They could not stop bleeding. They could not bring down a fever that climbed and climbed until it consumed a child from the inside out. In the German medical system, once a model of efficiency and innovation, there was nothing left. The hospitals were bombed-out husks. The doctors were at the front or dead. The pharmacies had been picked clean months ago. The few nurses who remained moved through the wards like ghosts, administering what comfort they could with empty hands. Morphine was a memory. Sulfa drugs were rumors. Bandages were rags, and rags were precious. The women had learned to pray for swift deaths, because slow ones were unbearable. Greta Hoffmann had been a schoolteacher before the war. She had taught literature and history to children who still believed the world was a place of order and reason. She had read them Goethe and Schiller, had tried to instill in them a love of beauty and truth. Her classroom had been bright and clean, with maps on the walls and flowers on her desk. She had been proud of her work. She had been proud to be German. Now she crouched in the dark and listened to her daughter drown in her own lungs. Lise had been a bright child, quick with numbers and curious about everything. She had asked 1,000 questions a day. Asterisk, why is the sky blue? Where do the stars go in the morning? What happens to people when they die? Asterisk, Greta had tried to answer honestly, to preserve the child's wonder even as the world collapsed around them. But now Lise asked nothing. She lay on a bed of coats and blankets, her face pale as candle wax, her lips cracked and bleeding. Greta had tried everything she knew. She had boiled water and made the child drink it. She had wrapped her in every piece of clothing they had. She had sung to her the old lullabies her own mother had sung, songs about birds and forests and safety. Nothing helped. The fever climbed. The child's breathing grew shallower. Frau Weber touched Greta's shoulder. "You must prepare yourself," the old woman whispered. Greta said nothing. She had already prepared herself 100 times. Preparation changed nothing. The thunder of American artillery had stopped, but now there was a new sound: engines. Trucks and half-tracks grinding through the rubble-choked streets. The women in the cellar went silent, listening. They had heard the stories. Some said the Americans were liberators, that they brought food and medicine and justice. Others said they were no different from the Russians, that they raped and burned and butchered. No one knew what to believe anymore. The truth had become as fragmented as the cities. Frau Weber blew out the candle. Darkness swallowed the cellar whole. Footsteps above. Boots on broken stone. A voice calling out in English, words the women did not understand. Then another voice, speaking German with a strange accent. "Is anyone down there? We are American soldiers. We will not hurt you." No one moved. Fear is older than language, deeper than politics. The voice called again. "We have medical supplies. If anyone is injured or sick, we can help." Greta felt something crack open inside her chest. She did not decide to move. Her body simply moved, as if pulled by a force outside herself. She stumbled to the cellar stairs, pushed open the splintered door, and stepped into the gray winter light. 4 American soldiers stood in the ruins of the schoolyard. They were young, younger than she expected, and they looked tired and cold. One of them held a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. Another carried a canvas bag with a white cross painted on its side. Greta opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She had not spoken English since she was a girl. The words had fled. The soldier with the bag stepped forward. He said something she did not understand, then made a gesture, pointing to the bag, then to the cellar. His eyes were brown and kind. Greta nodded. She could not stop nodding. She turned and stumbled back down the stairs, and the soldier followed. What happened next would be seared into Greta Hoffmann's memory for the rest of her life, vivid and immutable as a photograph. The American soldier, his name was Private James O'Connor from Philadelphia, though she would not learn that until later, knelt beside Lise and opened his medical kit. It was not large. It was a rectangular canvas bag, olive drab, no bigger than a shoebox. But when he opened it, Greta saw a kind of abundance she had forgotten existed. Inside were things she had not seen in years. Gauze bandages, white and clean and neatly rolled. Glass vials of morphine and penicillin. Sulfanilamide powder in paper packets. Iodine in brown bottles. Surgical scissors that gleamed like jewelry. Adhesive tape. Cotton swabs. Aspirin tablets in tins. A thermometer in a metal case. The soldier worked quickly and efficiently. He took Lisa's temperature, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and made a notation on a small pad. He unwrapped a syringe from sterile packaging, drew clear liquid from a vial, and administered an injection. Penicillin. The miracle drug the Germans had heard about but never seen. He crushed aspirin tablets and mixed them with water, tilted Lisa's head back, and coaxed the mixture into her mouth. He dampened a clean cloth with fresh water from a canteen and wiped her face with a gentleness that made Greta's throat constrict. The other women had emerged from the shadows now, watching in silence. Frau Weber clutched her photograph and wept without sound. The young mother with the 3-month-old baby stepped forward, trembling, and the soldier looked up and nodded. He gestured for her to bring the child. The baby had a rash across its stomach, angry red welts that had been spreading for days. The soldier opened a tube of ointment and applied it with careful fingers. He moved through the cellar like a priest administering sacraments. Every woman received something. Bandages for a cut that had festered. Vitamins for the children. Iodine for infected sores. He did not speak much. The language barrier was too great, but he did not need to. His actions were a language older and clearer than words. When he finished, he stood and looked at Greta. He placed one hand on her shoulder and said something in English. She did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. "Your daughter will live." And she did. The German women of the Reich had been prepared for many things. They had been prepared to sacrifice, to endure, to die if necessary for the fatherland. They had been taught that the enemy was monstrous, that the Americans and British were gangsters and plutocrats who hated the German people and wanted only to destroy them. They had been shown propaganda films depicting American soldiers as grinning savages, burning churches and shooting prisoners. What they had not been prepared for was kindness. They had not been prepared for the abundance. The sheer, staggering, unfathomable abundance. The medical kit that Private O'Connor carried was standard issue. Every American soldier in the European theater had one. Every medic had several. The supplies he used so freely in that cellar, the penicillin, the morphine, the clean bandages, were not rare treasures hoarded for officers and elites. They were ordinary. They were expected. They were the baseline. In the German Wehrmacht, a soldier carried a first-aid kit that consisted of a single field dressing, a triangular bandage, and perhaps a small tin of aspirin if he was lucky. If he was wounded, he hoped a medic might reach him before he bled out. If he was very lucky, he might be evacuated to a field hospital where overworked doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia because there was none left. German soldiers wrote letters home begging their families to send bandages, medicine, anything. The families had nothing to send. The American soldiers landed in Europe with more medical supplies than the entire German army possessed. Each division had its own field hospitals with X-ray machines, blood plasma, surgical suites equipped with modern instruments. The Americans had enough penicillin to treat not only their own wounded but the wounded of their enemies. They had enough to share. They had enough to waste. This was not an accident. This was not luck. This was the product of an industrial and economic system so vast and so powerful that it could simultaneously wage war on two fronts, build ships and planes faster than the enemy could sink or shoot them down, feed its own people and its allies, and still have enough left over to show mercy to the defeated. The women in that cellar did not understand this immediately. They could not. The scale was too large, the contrast too extreme. But they felt it. They felt it in the weight of the medical kit, in the casual confidence with which the soldier distributed supplies that would have been priceless treasures in any German hospital. They felt it in the waste, the astonishing waste. The soldier discarded the packaging from the syringe, tossed aside the used cotton swab, left half a bottle of iodine because it was more efficient to carry a fresh one than to save the dregs. In the Reich, nothing was wasted. Every scrap was saved, repurposed, hoarded. In America, abundance made waste irrelevant. Private O'Connor and his squad stayed in the village for 3 days. They set up a makeshift aid station in the remains of the church and treated anyone who came. The line stretched down the street. Women and children mostly, and old men too frail to have been conscripted. They came with infections and malnutrition, with wounds that had gone untreated for months, with diseases that should have killed them. The Americans treated them all. Word spread. More people came from neighboring villages, walking miles through the snow. The Americans brought in more supplies, called for reinforcements. Army doctors arrived, setting up tents and triage stations. They performed surgeries in the open air, amputating frostbitten limbs, removing shrapnel, setting broken bones. They worked 18-hour shifts and then worked more. Greta Hoffmann watched all of this with a kind of dazed wonder. Lisa's fever broke on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, the child was sitting up, asking for food. The American soldiers gave her chocolate from their rations, K-rations stamped with English words and wrapped in waxed paper. Lise held the chocolate bar like a holy relic, unwilling to eat it, unwilling to believe it was real. Greta tried to thank Private O'Connor. She attempted English, fumbled the words, switched to German. He did not understand, but he smiled and shook his head, waved away her gratitude as if it were unnecessary. He showed her a photograph from his wallet, a young woman with dark hair and a little boy, maybe 3 years old. His wife and son. He pointed to the boy, then to Lise, and shrugged as if to say, "What else would I do?" Greta understood then. This was not propaganda. This was not a strategic calculation. This was simply what these men believed was right. They had crossed an ocean and risked their lives not for conquest, not for plunder, but because they believed, truly, deeply believed, that all people deserved to be free from tyranny, that children should not die of treatable illnesses, that the strong had an obligation to protect the weak. It was an idea so foreign to the world Greta had been living in that it felt like a revelation. The Third Reich had been built on a different philosophy. It had been built on hierarchy, on the idea that some people were inherently superior to others, that the strong had the right to dominate the weak, that mercy was weakness and compassion was decadence. The propaganda had been relentless. Germany was surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy her. Only through strength, through unity, through absolute obedience to the Führer could the Volk survive. Sacrifice everything. Trust nothing. The world is a battleground, and only the ruthless will prevail. For 12 years, this ideology had been drilled into every German citizen. It had been taught in schools, preached from pulpits, broadcast on every radio, printed in every newspaper. It had shaped a generation. Greta herself had believed parts of it, or at least had not questioned it, because to question was dangerous and she had a daughter to protect. But ideology is abstract. It lives in the realm of words and symbols. It can justify anything, explain away any atrocity, because it is not tethered to the human and the real. The medical kit was real. The clean bandage wrapped around her daughter's arm was real. The chocolate bar melting in Lisa's hand was real. And these real things, these small tangible acts of care, spoke a truth more powerful than any speech or slogan. They said, "You are not my enemy. Your child is not my enemy. We are all human, and that is enough." As the weeks passed and the American army advanced deeper into Germany, more and more women had encounters like Greta's. In every town and village, the same scene repeated with variations. American soldiers arrived, and the terrified civilians emerged from their hiding places expecting the worst. Instead, they found men who handed out food rations, who set up field kitchens and served hot soup, who treated injuries and illnesses without asking about politics or party membership. The contrast was jarring, disorienting. Many of the women had sons or husbands in the Wehrmacht who had written home about the brutal conditions on the Eastern Front, about the lack of supplies, about watching comrades die not from enemy bullets but from infections and dysentery because there was no medicine. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to have everything in infinite supply. In Munich, a woman named Ilse Brenner watched American medics distribute vitamin pills to schoolchildren. She had not seen a fresh orange in 4 years. Her own children suffered from scurvy, their gums bleeding, their teeth loose. The Americans gave them vitamin C tablets as casually as candy. Ilse stood in the street and wept. In Hamburg, a nurse named Margaret Scholl was conscripted to work in an American field hospital. She had trained in one of the best hospitals in Europe, but by 1945 she was working in a bombed-out clinic with no electricity and no supplies. The American hospital was a different universe. They had blood plasma. They had X-ray machines powered by portable generators. They had antibiotics, anesthetics, sterile instruments. They performed surgeries she had only read about in textbooks. She asked one of the American doctors how they could afford all of this. He looked at her, puzzled by the question, and said, "It's just what we have. Every unit has this. Just what we have." The phrase haunted her. The medical kit became a symbol, though no one intended it as such. It was simply a tool, a collection of supplies designed to save lives. But in the hands of defeated women who had lost everything, it transformed into something larger. It became proof of a different kind of society, a society that valued life enough to spend its treasure preserving it, that believed in human dignity enough to extend it even to enemies. The white cross painted on the canvas bag was meant only to designate medical supplies, to protect the wearer under the Geneva Conventions. But the women saw it differently. They saw it as a symbol of hope, of healing, of a world where scarcity was not the default condition of existence. Frau Weber, the old nurse who had prayed in the cellar, began carrying a scrap of white cloth with a cross drawn in charcoal. She showed it to other women as a kind of talisman. "This is what they brought us," she would say. "This is what they are." The irony was not lost on the more educated among them. Germany had been Christian too, at least nominally. The churches had blessed the armies, had prayed for victory, had largely remained silent as the regime murdered millions. The cross had been co-opted, twisted into a symbol of conquest and racial purity. But here were men from across the ocean, men who spoke a different language and came from a different culture, who embodied the ideals that Christianity claimed to teach. Love your neighbor, heal the sick, feed the hungry. It was a devastating indictment, though no one spoke it aloud at first. The implications were too large, too painful. Greta Hoffmann's daughter recovered fully. Within 2 weeks, Lise was running through the ruins with the other children, playing games among the rubble, her laughter a sound so unexpected it made the adults stop and stare. Greta kept the empty penicillin vial that Private O'Connor had used. She wrapped it in cloth and hid it in her pocket like a relic. She thought often about the soldier. She wondered if he had survived the war, if he had made it home to his wife and son. She hoped so. She prayed for him, though prayer felt strange now, complicated. She did not know what she believed anymore. The old certainties had crumbled along with the cities. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Her daughter was alive because an American soldier had decided that a German child's life was worth saving. He had not asked her about her politics. He had not demanded to see party papers or interrogated her about what she had believed or supported during the war. He had seen a sick child and he had helped. It was that simple and that profound. In the spring of 1945, as the Reich collapsed entirely and the full horror of the concentration camps was revealed, Greta struggled with a question that many German women were asking themselves. How much had she known? How much had she chosen not to know? She had seen the Jewish families in her town disappear. She had heard the whispers, the rumors. She had told herself it was none of her business, that she had to protect her daughter, that there was nothing she could do anyway. The medical kit did not absolve her of that guilt. Nothing could. But it did offer a different vision of how human beings could choose to treat one another. It said that even in the midst of total war, even when you had every reason to be hard and cruel, you could still choose mercy. You could still choose to see the humanity in your enemy. The American army was not perfect. Greta knew this. She heard the stories of looting, of soldiers taking watches and cameras as souvenirs, of drunken fights and occasional violence. The Americans were human, capable of pettiness and cruelty like anyone else. But the difference was this: the cruelty was individual, not systematic. The mercy was institutional. The German system had been built on cruelty and called it strength. The American system was built on abundance and called it ordinary. This abundance was not magic. It was the product of factories that had never been bombed, of farms that had never been battlefields, of an economy that had been mobilized for war without being destroyed by it. It was the product of a political system that, for all its flaws, valued human life and human dignity as foundational principles. It was the product of a culture that believed in progress, in the possibility of making the world better, in the idea that the future did not have to be a zero-sum struggle for survival. The women of Germany had lived in a zero-sum world for 6 years. Everything was rationed, everything was scarce, every gain was someone else's loss. The ideology of the Reich had told them this was natural, that life was inherently a struggle and only the fit would survive. The medical kit said otherwise. It said that abundance was possible, that cooperation was stronger than domination, that a society could be organized around care rather than conquest. In the decades after the war, Greta Hoffmann rarely spoke about those years. The memories were too painful, too tangled with guilt and grief. But she kept the penicillin vial. She kept it on a shelf in her kitchen, where she could see it every day. Lise grew up, married, had children of her own. She became a doctor, specializing in pediatrics. She never knew exactly why she chose that path, only that it felt necessary, like something she owed. Greta never told her daughter the full story of that day in the cellar. Some things are too large to fit into words. But sometimes, late at night, Greta would take down the vial and hold it in her palm. She would remember the young American soldier with the kind eyes, the way he had knelt in the dirt and opened his kit with such casual confidence, as if saving lives was the most natural thing in the world. She would think about the thousands of other women across Germany who had similar stories, who had been shown mercy when they expected destruction, who had been given food when they were starving, medicine when they were sick, hope when they had none. She would think about the choice that those soldiers had made, to see her not as an enemy but as a human being, and to treat her daughter not as the child of a defeated nation but simply as a child. And she would think about the kind of society that could produce such men, that could send an entire army across the ocean not to conquer but to liberate, that could afford to be generous even in the midst of total war. The White Cross on the medical kit was never meant to carry such weight. It was just a marking, a practical designation. But symbols are not chosen. They emerge from the spaces between intention and interpretation, from the gap between what something is and what it means to the people who encounter it. For the women of Germany in the spring of 1945, that White Cross came to represent something they had been told did not exist. A world where mercy was not weakness, where abundance was possible, where the strong protected the weak not out of condescension but out of conviction. It represented a future they had not imagined, a future where their children might grow up in peace, where food and medicine were not luxuries but expectations, where the value of a human life was not measured by race or nationality, but simply by the fact of being human. The Reich had promised them glory. It had delivered ashes. The Americans promised them nothing. They simply opened their medical kits and treated the wounded. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Private James O'Connor returned to Philadelphia in the fall of 1945. He went back to his job at the post office, raised his son, coached Little League baseball, and lived a quiet, ordinary life. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he would shrug and say he had done his part, same as everyone else. He never knew that a German woman kept an empty penicillin vial on her kitchen shelf for 40 years, that she prayed for him every night, that she told her daughter's daughter about the American soldier who had saved a life when he did not have to, when it would have been easier not to. He never knew that he had changed the course of a woman's understanding of what was possible, what was true, what was good. He never knew that in the ruins of a schoolhouse in the Ruhr Valley, he had planted a seed of something that would grow and spread and outlive the Reich by generations. The idea that humanity is not a scarce resource, that compassion is not a luxury, that the mark of a great civilization is not how it treats its heroes, but how it treats the sick and the defeated and the afraid. The medical kit was just a tool. But tools can build worlds. And sometimes, in the right hands, they do.